My name's Nicola Baldwin, and I am co-chair of the audio committee, and you're going to be hearing from my other co-chair, Lucy Goff, in a sec. The Tinniswood Award, as you will probably know, it was established in 2003 to commemorate Peter Tinniswood, who was a radio writer, and the purpose of the award is to celebrate his memory and his achievements and reward the best original drama that was written for audio that year. It's administered by the Society of Authors and the Writers Guild, and the prize money is provided by the Authors Licensing and Copyright Society. So I guess indirectly from authors as well. We had a record number of entries this year, and we had plays that came in from Radio 3, Radio 4, from Audible, from Apple, from Buzzsprout, from Harbour FM, from iTunes, from Podbean, from Resonance, and quite a lot of individual podcasts that had been broadcast as part of various projects. And although there was some of the non-broadcast pieces made it to the long list, it so happens this year that all of the shortlist came from Radio 4. But we're really glad to see the kind of growing reach of the Tinniswood Award. So just a quick word before we go on to meeting each one of the shortlisted writers. Lucy Goff, my co-chair, do you want to just say something briefly about what we did for the judging process?
Well, the judging process, as we were talking about earlier, actually was just such great fun, because it was wonderful to see such a broad canvas of so many different plays. But basically, we shared them out between the four of us, and we basically everything got read at least twice. And then we worked down to a short list, and then we read them again, and a long list, sorry, and then a short list. And I think we drew up a criteria that we all agreed that we were looking for, which gave us plenty of room to discuss. So after each phase, we met and discussed, and then went on to the next list. And it was just a fascinating experience, wasn't it?
Yeah, definitely. So the plays that you're going to hear about tonight, the ones that made the shortlist, are through this kind of filter of four people who love audio drama and love reading good writing, are various shared opinions. So without further ado, I would like to turn to the winner of this year's Tinniswood Award, Edson Burton. Congratulations.
Thank
Edson.
you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well deserved. And my first question is, if you could just tell us briefly, really briefly, what Man Friday is about.
So Man Friday is inspired by Robinson Crusoe, and it's a reworking, a reimagining of it, in which Friday and Crusoe meet as equals. But in this version, Friday is Kofi, which is the Akan, a name for a person born on that day of the week. And together they work out a way of genuinely reconciling, hiding their histories, and then sort of revealing to each other who they really are, and then having to work out a relationship between them both. And it flips on its head in some ways, the idea of colonial encounter. So who is discovered, who is other? And these two men on an island have to sort of reinvent the possibilities of what encounter can look like between different people. And no spoiler alert.
Fantastic. I wanted to ask something about your writing process, and whether it was different or your usual one for this one, but in whether it was different or usual, do you start to hear the play, or do you kind of see the play? You know, how do those pieces, from having an initial idea, even if you've put in a pitch and you've refined your pitch, when you actually come to write it, what was your kind of route into putting those pieces together?
I think on the one hand, I had a sense of what the play was about, or how I wanted to flip it, and to reimagine Kofi. And I could hear Kofi very strongly, and then also I could hear Crusoe. And in some ways, I didn't want to sort of force a particular perspective, ideology. I wanted these characters to be real, and they felt real, and I could hear them. The difficulty with this play, I think, is I wanted to try and keep something of the original. And I found so much of I didn't find that there was much in the original that was useful to how I wanted to reimagine the encounter. So in a sense, it was as much as anything a case of editing, but really sort of drilling down and constantly asking myself, what is this play really about? And in the end, I realized it was a love affair, really, between two men, but one that goes through the mill of difference and anger, and so on. And also, and it goes through power relationships that have been imposed upon them. So by their external identities and how they're socialized, so that they have to make sense of who they are and who they are in relationship to each other, almost afresh. So in a sense, that was the more difficult path of the imagining and the writing, whereas the two characters themselves, they felt alive. But what did I want to do with what were they going to say, when they came together?
It's very interesting. Actually, on a similar vein, one of the things, and this is sort of unpicking that process a little bit more, and I'm just picking up a question that's come in the chat about the audio. We listened to the audio versions afterwards. We just concentrated on what was there on the page with all the scripts. And one of the things that I really noticed in your script, Edson, was such clarity of purpose. There was a real sense that I was really hooked. And you saying that it was quite tricky to bring in something of the novel, but I think it's actually quite novelistic, not because there's loads of description, but as well as all the character beats that are happening, you've got descriptions of the goats, you've got little things that are happening, you've got almost like shots of people noticing the landscape and their individual relationship with the landscape. I haven't read any of your other work, but I wondered if that was something that is kind of unique to this, because it was very much a sense of two men in this space.
I think I do have yeah, thank you. I think I do have a fairly visual imagination. I mean, I look out and I see the world through the eyes of Crusoe and Kofi, and I guess that's true of my other work. That, in a sense, it is alive to me in the sense that it's textual and it's reachable. I hear the goat and I can see the meadow and the screen and the ship and the bodies floating in the ship. And in some ways, I think perhaps partly that helps being a poet, that so much of my inspiration in poetry is through what I see and feel, the sensory world and how I connect to it. And in some ways, with the island, I very much wanted it to feel that it wasn't sort of two sort of spoken heads in space, but these were two people in an active world, a world that moves and sings and has all that dynamism, because also it's so much a part of their story and their change. So yeah, I mean, I always feel pushed to say that in reality, I think, yes, it's probably more visual to me, initially, that maybe it's just that they feel very alive. I think I know when a play is working, when I can hear the voices and I can see where they are, and I can see the table, or I can see the goat, or I can see Kofi very badly trying to create this hut and Crusoe doing a better job or not. Yeah.
Learning how to do Zoom again. Yeah, I totally get that. And actually, on the thing of listening versus reading, that we would sometimes listen at a very late stage when we've read them. And certainly with all the 4 plays tonight, there was a real sense when you heard it going, there they are. There's people that you'd read on the page were there. Fantastic. Well, we're going to come back to you when we go on to general questions later. But thank you very much. Congratulations again. And if you haven't already heard Man Friday, please do click on the link. You're in for a treat. And then if you have heard it, listen to it again. Lucy.
Hi, Dan. Well, actually, I'm going to start by asking similar to Nicola. Can you just briefly give us an outline of what it was about? Because I think it's a good lead into the next question.
Well, the starting point of it is something that really happened, which was that a man called Max Brod took the last train out of Czechoslovakia in February 1938, just before the Nazis invaded. And Max Brod was a friend of Franz Kafka, who had died 15 years or so before, and he was carrying a case full of Kafka manuscripts. And what happens in the course of the play is that his train journey gets more and more, I guess, sort of surreal and strange, and people no longer seem to be who they appear to be at the beginning, and eventually he meets his dead friend Kafka, and that's it, really.
Great, and that's really helpful lead into the question that I want to ask you. One of the aspects we found most impressive about your drama, amongst others, was the subtle, delicately placed signposts, which enable the listener to enter fully into the nightmarish world. I think this was due to it was so playfully and lightly, but exactly, and it demonstrates a true understanding of the potential and depth of audio drama. So there's a quote from your play, which 2 inches to the left, which I loved. And I mean, it just struck me, and I may be wrong, but it just struck me that it felt like a mantra for the whole way you conceived this play, both for yourself as you approached it and for the listener to receive it. But what I loved about it was what we all loved about it was that delicate way that you enable us to be in that nightmarish world. And do you agree with that, having picked out that quote, or am I way off beam there?
No, that is really interesting. I think that it was actually something that a rabbi once said.
Oh, right. Okay.
Which was that it's something like he said, the perfect world will be like this one, but 2 inches left. I thought there was something really interesting about something
Absolutely.
being familiar and yet unfamiliar, which is obviously something I want to do in the play. And that's very lovely, the way you describe the play. I mean, certainly one of the things that I was very aware of is I think the real challenge, I think, of writing something that's quite surreal is you can do anything. So why have you done this? Do you know what I mean? And so you needed to, I sort of felt it was quite important that there was a purposeful journey through the play, so that each step felt like it was adding something rather than just going, and now we're doing this crazy thing. And so there was certainly, I very kind of quite carefully plotted out the descent into strangeness and the moments where you go, oh wait, this is not what I expected it to be at all. And the idea was that would accumulate an effect, but also keep you in the situation. And so that's why I was really drawn to Max Brod's train journey escaping from the Nazis, because what that means is the structure is a kind of wartime thriller, he's trying to escape. There's genuine peril and tension. It's a confined space, you're on a train, there's only so far you could go, and that of course gives you a very, very linear kind of structure to it, so that when you disrupt that, you've got all sorts of really interesting textures, yet I think the audience, I hope, feels held by that.
Absolutely, that's what struck us, I think, was absolutely because a surreal world can be anything, can't it? And as you say, you can be lost, but you feel this surreality all the more because you're there. You enable the audience to actually be there, which I think is, and that requires a really delicate touch, which I think you've managed really well. And the sort of playfulness with which you use lots of references like Kafka, and that line at the end of the first scene where he says, I've turned into an insect or something, just the way you fed things in that enabled us to construct all these worlds, and the surreality worked really well. Have I got time for another question? Yeah? Okay. Although I'm sure this could transfer to another medium, reworked, do you agree that the very fluid nature of audio and its direct connection to the imagination and the subconscious mean that writing for audio offers possibilities not found anywhere else?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was really was conceived
Mm.
in radio terms. It would change a huge amount if it was done on stage or on film or whatever. Uh, and there's quite a good example of this. And I was thinking about this when you were asking Edson about how visual it is when you imagine it. There's a bit, in fact, it happens a few times. It's set on a train, and there's a point where he says, I've got to go all the way back to the front carriage. And one of the characters says, don't worry, I know a shortcut. And of course, I have no visual image of what a shortcut on a train looks like, because that it's not, clearly it's not possible, but it's perfectly possible on radio. It just kind of works. You go, oh, a shortcut. Yes, that door there. And then he's back in the front carriage. And you just have to sort of accept it. And I think that's a kind of lovely thing that obviously you could do in prose and you could do in your imagination and you could do on radio, but it's quite hard to do on, I mean, on TV. Somehow it needs to become more literal.
Mhm.
So I think, yeah, it's the thing I liked as well, of course, is that it's called Restless Dreams because of that the first line of Metamorphosis, that Gregor Samsa awoke from a night of restless dreams to discover he'd been transformed into a monstrous insect. And I want it to have that dreamlike quality, where, when you and when anybody tells you your dream, they kind of go, it was really weird because you were there, but you were also my dad, and I was, I was back at school, but it was in the present. So everything's kind of overlaid on each other, and everything sort of shimmers, and all the identities start to blur. And I wanted to give it a sense of that, and I think radio is really good at doing that sort of thing because, again, it doesn't commit you to an absolutely literal enactment of place or character or whatever. You just have to kind of, because your imagination is filling in stuff, you can just constantly populate the imagination in increasingly weird ways, I think.
Mhm. And actually that increases the sense of anxiety and the surreality of it for the listener as well, doesn't it? Yeah, in a way that I think you'd be hard pressed to find anywhere else. Yeah, thank you.
Satinder, hi there. Congratulations as well to all of you for being shortlisted. And I wanted to ask you really just initially a little brief sense of what Southall Uprising is about, for those of us that can't guess from the title.
Could be at any point in history, really, but
Yes.
it is based on true events, and it is based on an event that happened in 1979 in Southall, which involved the far right, the National Front, coming to town. They basically decided to hold a very provocative pre-election rally right in the heart of Southall, which at that time in the late 70s was becoming a sort of increasingly big and established immigrant community. And basically the drama is about the events of that day, where the community basically banded together and in this amazing kind of story of struggle and resistance, basically fought back against the National Front, not only the National Front, but also the British establishment that had been put into place to uphold the sort of freedom of speech and democracy, allowing the National Front to air their views. And it was an incredible act of solidarity between all community members, but it did result in, very tense clashes between the community and the police. And there was a tragic murder at the end of the day. Blair Peach, he was killed that day. And so, so the events of Southall Uprising, I mean, it's an impossible task because it's almost it's an event that could be told from a multitude of perspectives. So this was my attempt to take one aspect of it to try to get some sense, introductory sense to the events of that day.
Very good description, actually, because it is, like you say, it's on paper just feels like an almost impossible task. And following on from that, I wanted to think about the writing process for Southall Rising. I mean, in particular, you grew up obviously in Southall anyway, and how you approached the research process, and if you knew what you were looking for, but whether it was something that you found, because I know that I think it's somebody probably like Robert McKee says, you don't know a thing until you've written it down. You know, even if you're writing a script that's based on your street or your next door neighbor, it's when you start to write it down, it kind of acquires these layers of meaning. How complicated or how easy was the process of taking that story and making it into a script?
Well, I've long wanted to tell this story, and I wanted to tell it. I actually wanted to do it sort of on film, and that's something I would still really, really love to do, because I think it would make an incredible sort of cinematic story as well, for all the reasons that you've already discussed, and with Dan as well. The idea that the audio rendering gives just one kind of story, but if you did it cinematically, it would be so different. But yeah, the research. So I was researching actually much prior to this project as well, and I've interviewed local people. So that was very much part of my research process, was to speak to family and friends and local community members, activists, people who were involved in the uprising, and just basically collating lots of interviews. So that was quite a long task of sifting through those. And then just having this, just having a kind of massive material, almost archival material, and then trying to whittle it down into a much more personal story, because of course there was the massive material. There is the very kind of heavy politics that is involved in the events of that day as well. How do you dramatize that? How do you distill all of that into a story? So I think that was the task, and that was the question that I had to ask myself. And I felt like I always write, and most of my stories are centered around female protagonists, like just I feel like obviously women, we should have a voice, we should have more of a voice. So my natural bias is always I want a female protagonist, but I felt like there had to be a young male protagonist in this story, because in the late 70s, young women weren't really as involved. Young Asian women weren't really as involved in the local politics of the area because of cultural limitations. And so it was the young Asian men who were really taking up a kind of very active stance that was very contrary to the previous generation. So this story felt like it had to be a kind of intergenerational conflict as well, as much as it was about a community against the police, the state, local government, national government. It was also about a younger generation kicking back against their parents, who had said, be docile, be passive, keep your heads down, keep working, because that's what the previous generation had done, through instances of racism or, sort of suggested exclusion with the National Front. And it was the younger generation, and especially the younger males in the community, who basically, and my brother was one of them. My brother, he was at secondary school in Southall, and he and the other boys in the school, there would be clashes with the National Front at the end of most school days, and that was their experience at school. And at some point there was a breaking point, where it was almost like enough. We have to do something as a community. We have to do something to fight back. So it was all these little strands that sort of just trying to extrapolate all these different kinds of narrative strands and to create something from that, to personalize the story, to individualize it, because it was very much about that sort of relationship between the individual and the collective. Because as much as this story is about the rise, and the threat, the provocation, the aggressions of the far right, it's also very much a story about the power of community. And so it's very much about this male protagonist finding his place, finding his power within that sort of in that space of community. So I guess a coming of age story, so
I was actually just going to say that's how it felt. It's like a coming of age story, but then at the same time, it's also a kind of political consciousness raising. So, like, you know, the dad who's like wanting to carry on with the not wanting to be antagonistic, just do things as usual, and it's like everybody. It's a rebirth of a community.
Exactly. And actually, I would say it's the birth of a community.
Yes, yes.
I think it's a coming of age of Rami, my character, but I think it's also the coming of age of a Black Asian community in Britain. And so that's what that moment felt like to us, experiencing it, growing up through it, growing up and hearing about it, was that this was a very kind of nascent moment in Black Asian Britain. And it was about the birth. It was about a Black Asian community standing up and saying, we have the right to live and work and exist in this country, you know, regardless of the threats that are coming our way. So yeah, it's a coming of age on a dramatic level, but also on a political level as well, and on a community level.
Fantastic. As you said, I mean, it's phenomenally ambitious. And I think one of the things, when I first started reading it, I was thinking, I almost can't see how this is going to be able to come into land. It's such a big flying ship, but it's totally riveting. And it does all the things that if one is teaching somebody audio writing, that you would probably say it's maybe not a good idea to do. You know, the number of protagonists that we're following, and we're following them all over the place. And I know that you recorded on location as well, didn't you?
Yeah,
What was that like? And was it nerve-wracking, or by that time do you just think we're just going to go through this and see?
Oh, it was incredible. And Nadia, my director producer, I think it was one of the few, I mean, I could be completely wrong, but I think it was one of the few drama productions that year that was on location. Very, very, very few are recorded on location. And it was incredible to be in the town hall where the National Front held their rally, and to record scenes in the town hall. You know, the streets outside being where the community had got together in protest. And it was just incredibly inspiring. And then we also recorded at my parents' house. And my mother is she has dementia, but she was so confused when you know, we had this whole cast and crew sort of traipsing through the house and recreating these scenes, and that was just, it was so wonderful just to try to capture some of that Southall spirit. And you know, we had extras from drama students from Uxbridge Technical College. We had members of the Punjabi Theatre Academy, which is a small sort of theatre group in Southall. So we really tried to encourage that kind of community involvement as well as recording on the street. So yeah, just
yeah. How many altogether were involved in the cast?
I'd say, I think there were maybe about 15 or something, but you know, and then just recording on location, just recording the sounds in the town as well, because that, you know, Southall Uprising is very much about this urban soundscape. And actually, with what was really special about that time in the late 70s as well was because musically it was also a time of punk, of bhangra and reggae. And you couldn't have a more sort of, you know, sort of multicultural mix of musical styles. So we knew that we were going to intercut the drama with that as well. But to have the sounds of the streets of Southall, the people, yeah, it felt incredibly special. And it felt like from the get-go, it felt wrong to record it in a studio for all those reasons.
Thank you and congratulations. I will come back in the group chat, depending how we go. Lucy.
Hi, Kirsty. Thank you for agreeing to talk for Robert. Yeah, so basically, we really admired the rich tapestry this play managed to weave at the present and layers of past stories and myths are channeled into it. As well as the richness and boldness of the language, it managed to say so much about humanity and all its complexities and the story it built up. It was a very rich and bold play which deals deftly and sensitively with a number of subjects, whilst also filling the space with this wonderful, vivid and evocative visual images. It felt that masterfully the truth of the story was appearing from underneath. It was almost like it was bubbling up from the layers, from the surface. I've said all that because what I was going to say was I imagine it's quite a delicate one to handle in production. You know, I just think there's all because of the layers. I imagine that that it was quite challenging. So I was just wondering whether that was the case, and if so, where do you start? You know, that's, sorry about that long introduction, but I was just trying to explain what it was that drew us to it.
Thank you. It's really good
to work so well with it. But I imagine that from your point of view, there are all those layers, and that must be a lot. Where do you start with looking at something, a play like this with all these layers?
Well, I mean, it's funnily enough been a play that has been bubbling within Robert for a long time.
Right.
So he had an idea. So to contextualize it, there is, he's drawing from Celtic mythology, but from a kind of part of Celtic mythology which was then taken in the 18th century when Celticness became a kind of form of exoticism, and people started being very interested in Celtic things. And suddenly a manuscript turned up, and it was written by this Celtic person and blah, blah, blah. And it turns out anyway that basically it was all made up, that it was all completely engineered by a man who made a lot of money out of it at the time. However, the mythology is very old. So he had wanted to kind of tackle that mythology for a long time anyway. And then he had this idea, and one of the kind of central premises is that Ossian, who is this part of in Celtic mythology, Ossian is a man who tells the stories of his father. And his father was a warrior and a king, and he goes around the world and tells these stories. And in the myths, there is a kind of saying that he continues to walk the land now. He went into the land of, I mean, it's, you know, it's really sellable. He went into the land of Faerie and came back out, and his dad was dead. Came back out, and it turned out that 100 years has passed. So he wanted to kind of tackle it because from a kind of cultural landscape, the idea that we take stories and we make them and we remake them felt really important, you know, and that kind of concept exists for most cultures, that we remake our mythology constantly. So he knew he wanted to do that. And then and a bit like, I suppose, what Edson said, he begins to see characters and hear characters before he starts to write. So he had kind of, this character had begun to talk in his, to Robert. And a long time ago, he sent me a kind of draft of something where a man was sitting in a hospital bed, which is how the play starts. And nobody knows who he is. And he has turned up in this hospital with nothing but a pocket full of leaves. And the kind of that concept, that image was just so striking to me and so magical and interesting. So when he then began to write, so absolutely, and what kind of tends to happen with, and so that's what happens, is that this man turns up, a minister is brought to speak to him, because they hope that she can, because he said something that they realize is a quote from the Bible. And so they send this minister along to try and get him to talk. And he keeps pretending to be asleep. And eventually he opens his eyes, and she's shocked by how green his eyes are. And so there's this kind of already this instant sense in which in some way he is otherworldly. And so he plays with that concept throughout and juxtaposes the conversations that they have with each other, with her life at home where she is caring for her mother who has dementia. And so it's effectively about a slippage in story, and a liminal space. Where is reality and where is fantasy? Where do they fold together? Which one informs us? All those things. And so, yeah, in a way, the whole process of working with Robert, which is often the process, but is much harder because Robert's writing is so like I've said often that I need to read a script at least twice to note it. And it's normally 2 bike rides, 2 reads and 2 bike rides, and I know what it is and I can note it, but I can never note his after 2 because it feels like he's so deeply into something that I have to go further in to get it. So what we tend to do is do a lot of talking about exactly that, what's bubbling there. It feels like this is happening, and I'll help kind of try to push stuff to the surface that will help the audience be able to hold on to the complexity of that character experience.
Yeah, because there's so much space, isn't there, in it, within those layers for the audience to really read. You know, the fragmentation of it is really effective, isn't it, in the way that it sort of relates the sense of dementia, but also the fragmentation of these old stories.
Yeah, and also I think it. Sorry, you were going to ask me a question.
No, go on. Say what you're going to say.
I think it absolutely taps into the very nature of what storytelling is for that reason. That because what he creates is a person who may be real, who may be a myth, who may just be a demented man in a hospital bed, but the pull towards him is effectively from a woman who is in herself in a state of crisis, who is struggling with where she is in her life, being drawn towards somebody who's telling a story, which of course is exactly why we listen. We listen to learn, to find our own humanity, to learn about versions of humanity that we have overlooked or not known about, you know. So in fact, the kind of very metaphorically, he is story in that sense, because we are pulled towards it to try and find a truth within ourselves and to fix ourselves. But what's of course wonderful about Robert is he absolutely refuses to do the fixing bit. Quite rightly. So he will present enough of it to allow us to understand that that's kind of what's going on, but refuse to tie it up too neatly.
Which is why it feels like the truth bubbles up from underneath, you know, as it happens. Bizarrely, I read them again today to be ready for today, and I had to stop halfway through because my mother's care home phoned to say that there was an argument over who owned the flowers that were on the table. So because they both didn't remember who, you know, so it was just quite bizarre, you know. It was just like reading this and then So I've got time for another question. Yeah. Right, you've produced a number of Robert's plays, haven't you? You work quite, So, what is it that draws you to his work? I mean, you've said a bit of that already, actually. And I'm asking this, you know, for the other writers that have come to this event as well, because I think it's useful for them to know what sort of things a producer director is looking for when they're reading a script. So, sort of talking generally about Robert's work, and then maybe about how that sort of informs what sort of things you look for when you're looking.
I think with Robert, the thing is that he is a man with significantly more experience than me. I think Robert's been writing since I was possibly 6. So he is, you know, there is a richness of his understanding that I am obviously drawn to because he can teach me a lot. But also because it's such rich intellectual fabric that he challenges me, and you watch, even with the actors, we go into studio and all of the actors are both completely excited by it, but don't exactly know where they'll go yet. They have a real, you know, it tends to be, as kind of all the people who've made an audio drama here will know, actors need to know what they're doing because we work so fast. But there's a kind of magic to his language and to his characterization that until it starts being spoken and explored isn't 100% clear, because you can keep finding and finding and finding. So that's exciting. It's exciting on the page, working in development with Robert. We tend to write each other massive letters. We do a lot of writing massive letters. And Robert won't even deliver he won't deliver a script without kind of sending notes with the script. So it's a kind of process of intellectual stimulation, I suppose.
what I'm getting from hearing you talk and from what I've read of the play is that there's a courage and boldness both in his writing, but also in your perception of it and your willingness to the way you work with it, which is really lovely to hear, actually. Yeah. So if you were trying to help other writers that are in this room listening to us now, what sort of things jump out at, this might be quite a difficult question to answer actually, but what sort of things draw you to a script? What would draw you to a script if somebody sent you a script? I'm just trying to address questions that might feed into it.
Yeah, I mean, so I have this thing about particularly 45 that I think, which kind of, it's almost the opposite of Tinniswood, because to me, Tinniswood is people, the things that end up nominated for Tinniswood tend to be people who have done enough writing on audio that they can be incredibly ambitious in a way that you can't necessarily at the start. But for me, there's something about my kind of mantra is simple story, complex characters. That in a way, now actually Satinder nails that with the complexity of a filmic set still, but again, because she hones in on that family journey, like, you know, so, and a bit like what Edson said, and Dan actually, that there's kind of that it's got to be visual, but actually it's got to be character based. You've got, if you can see the world, because ultimately you've only got 45 minutes to take us on a journey. So if your journey is about complicated characters that feel complex and full, then I'm much more hooked by that, because watching how a character progresses feels much more interesting than, and works on radio in the way that exploring an idea doesn't work. It has to kind of be expressed via character.
Can I just come in there? Because actually, just throwing it open to the rest of the panel, because one of the questions we did get was from somebody who's just written their first radio play and is wondering what they've got wrong in the first draft. We all, you know, hopefully find out what we've got wrong in the first draft, and that's something you constantly face. But I just wanted to ask each of the shortlisted people, how do you think your sense of what you're doing has changed, if at all, in your writing?
I think in some ways I was perhaps unintentionally discovered what made my writing work in my first radio dramas, and then wanted to sort of go epic and have lots of characters and complex plots. And I think I've almost come full circle to celebrate, I think as Kirsty just said, that simplicity really of what am I really trying to do? I guess I think I'm much more intentional now about trying to bring the audience into the mind, into the intentions, into the complexity of the characters. And that, in a sense, if they're real to me, they need to be real and credible to me, perhaps in the sense that they will surprise me. And that, in a sense, not trying to kind of divert or just add more stuff, but stick with them, make their encounters and moments richer, deeper, more pervasive, or more persuasive. I think that's, yeah, and that's definitely, I think, came together in Man Friday, and what I need to remind myself of as an intention when writing.
In terms of how things have changed, I mean, I think I'm much more interested in structure than I was. But what that means is that there are things that I absolutely have locked down and set in place before I write a word. But it also means that I think I'm much clearer in my mind about the things I have to know before I start writing, and the things I absolutely must not know before I start writing. Because I think you know, I think probably 20 years ago I wasn't sure about what I needed to have figured out before I started actually writing a play, and I think I'm much clearer about that now. So, you know, it's kind of interesting that the play of mine that I was talking about is quite dreamlike, so feels very fluid and probably hopefully feels quite chaotic in various ways, but actually was really quite rigorously structured. but the climax of the play is when the main character meets Franz Kafka, impossibly, and I knew I just did not want to know what they talked about, and that would have to happen in the writing, because it felt like that had to just emerge in the kind of crazy logic of that encounter. So I think that's probably the thing I'd say.
I think the thing that's changed, I think I'd have to agree with Kirsty that it's just this drive towards a simpler storytelling, because I'm one of the kind of few writers, I think, who imagine worlds before characters. So I don't think of characters first. I think about the world that I'm going to create, and then I put the characters in it. And as I found, a lot of writers start with characters first, and I've always done the inverse. So it's about embedding, I think it's about embedding that, because I like these big complex worlds and I like epic, ambitious storytelling, same as Edson. It's like, how do I tell a simpler story through characters who embody that complexity, the complexity of that world? And I think it's just been a continued sort of creative journey towards that, trying to compress that world, rather than have that world spiral out of control and characters be disconnected from that world because there's no connection between the two. So I feel like, yeah, I don't want to forego the ambition of big storytelling, because I really enjoy it, because, you know, I like engaging with kind of global stories and communities and that kind of thing. So my protagonists are often community protagonists. But yeah, it's about that distillation again, and simplicity that I'm continuing to strive for.
Brilliant. Dan,
Yeah,
did you
can
have
I-
a comeback to the
No.
sorry, Dan had his hand up. Do you?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't notice.
I wanted to just pick up thing Satenda said, which is really interesting. That I think Kirsty, of course, is right. You want to have complex characters, but here's a kind of confession. I don't think about character at all. I think about what people do. I think about action, and if what they do is interesting and engaging and strange, character kind of takes care of itself. And I know there are writers who will kind of write biographies and, you know, where they went to school and all this sort of stuff. I find that a bit nosy, really. And I don't want to know what O levels or GCSEs they did. It's like, that's none of my business. I know that what they do is they walk out the house and then they disappear into thin air, or they decide they're going to crash their car today or something like that. I think once you commit to that, you get quite interesting characters.
I think that's not dissimilar, because what I actually mean is psychologically interesting. I don't really mean, you know, in terms of complexity. But I also think there's something interesting. What I was going to say is that I think simplicity doesn't mean that you can't be ambitious, because actually I think on radio, that liminal space that you can go into, that Dan's piece goes into so brilliantly, and Robert's, is itself massively ambitious, because you're pushing the boundaries between the real and the imagination, and taking the audience to places that are entirely technicolor.
I'm going to pick up on a question which came in from Nigel Deakin, who I can see on my screen, about how you judge, and this is, which I'm actually going to throw back to the panel, but it's on how, because this is a prize for the best audio drama of the year, how do we judge best? And I think that obviously it's a subjective choice. I think the way that we did it for judging this was each of us had our own criteria, and we had an initial chat of thinking about character, thinking about world, thinking about idea, thinking about story. But then we did that independently, and it was just like a weave. Like at each stage, we had ones that were our favourites, and then we talked about those, and we talked about why they were, and then we would read them again, and then we would come back together. And so it was as systematic as it was possible to be, but to keep alive the idea of wow, you know. And actually we were lucky, because there was a nice amount of wow, and then there was some big wows, and that's where we are today. But I'm just quite interested to hear from you guys, If there's particular things that you've, scripts you've read, maybe plays that you've heard, or things that you've written or been involved in, that really for you just, and you almost couldn't work out why, but really landed with you.
But if I give Moonlight as an example of a film that really vibrated with me, I say vibrated because I was surprised by the ambiguity of feeling that came from that film, that sense of an emotional impact that sits somewhere between tragedy and beauty of romance. That all things there were somehow contained, and it made me realize that in this world and in this imagining, the reification of the character would almost moved away from an intention to, this is what the film's about and this is what the impact I want to create. Something so much more almost jazz-likely musical occurred. And also, I guess in a sense, it worked for me because it kind of defeated so many, or played with so many tropes and flipped them on their heads around how we construct identities and characters. I think the sense of what Satinder was talking about with conflating worlds and yet seeing snapshots of worlds. So we see everything around race and class in the US, and we see it through a sliver of human experience. So that in a sense, we stick with the psychology of our character. They remain credible. I think the things that don't work for me is when I don't believe the character anymore, or I don't believe their choices because I no longer trust that they are real to the author. They've become kind of a mouthpiece of a value system. The challenge is to have one's values or something you want to say about the world, but that it feels that it entirely and authentically comes through your experience of the character. That there is somehow a meeting space between oneself as the writer and the values that you then hold, but somehow that gets channeled through and it happens, it kind of aligns perfectly. When it doesn't align, there's always sort of a sense of inauthenticity, something slightly broken. So I give that as one example among many others of work that I've enjoyed and why.
I just think that radio drama is probably the easiest form of drama to stop. Like you can just turn off a radio drama and it's gone and it's complete, and there's no embarrassment in the way that leaving a theatre or leaving a cinema or even closing a book, the book's still there, but the radio drama just goes. So I think the real achievement with a radio drama is to get that thing where people just lock into it. And it's weird, it's almost a physical thing. It feels like your mind has entered into the space of the play somehow, or it has sort of consumed you. And I think that thing, which I'm sure we've all had that experience where you're kind of like, you find more washing up to do so that you can keep listening to a play, that kind of thing. It sounds so basic, doesn't it? But I remember being told when I first wrote my first radio play that the afternoon drama started with like 2 million and usually ended up on average with 1 million. I was like, you lose half your audience. But that's of course because that audience is the Archer's audience. But I still kind of remember thinking, right, how do I keep them listening? How do I make sure that you get the hooks in them so they have to sit in their car and not get out and go to their meeting so that they can kind of keep listening. I think that's a big thing.
So Tinder, is that true for you? You kind of thinking about how it lands, or
Yeah, I think so, but I'd like to go back to what Edson was saying because his example was really intriguing, and I'm kind of in a similar vein, a director like, and I use filmic references because obviously radio drama, we think in images, okay? It's a very visual medium, even though it's an audio medium. And a director that I really love is Terrence Malick. And I feel like he really, he really explores and experiments with content and form, but also character, in the sense that it isn't just psychological or emotional, it's actually spiritual. And he creates these transcendent works of art. And I think there's just so much more. I mean, I'm not expert enough to do it, but I think there's just something in cracking those psychological, emotional worlds open, the content, the character, the form of drama, and that there's so much more that we are yet to explore. Because, I feel like, coming from the background I do, which is a very spiritual, political background, I sometimes find Western storytelling quite limiting, because it is about psychology of character. And, there's often, there are spiritual nuances or spiritual depths that I want to explore that I can't necessarily convey through the way that I have been taught how to write Western drama. So I don't know, there's something in that space that I'm really, really interested in. And I think radio is, it's just brilliant for that, because you can create whatever worlds you want, and you can infuse them with limitless images, whether they're spiritual or, emotional, political, whatever they might be. So I don't know, it's something in there that I'm finding really, really sort of, intriguing and challenging.
Kirsty, how about you? I mean, because you coming in to work on various projects all the time, but you yourself must have also things that influence you, or things that have blown you away, or just things you hear and see.
The thing is, so much, because I spend my entire life with earphones in. So the reality is, it's almost impossible to kind of, I have an image, a very clear image of, and I can't even remember what play it was, of listening to a play, washing dishes in a caravan, and it was Dan's. And I knew it was within the first minute, because of the rhythm of the language just asked me to stop, or asked me to listen. And so that thing, that kind of ability to captivate you. And there's places all around, particularly my house and the outside, near me, that just, I can kind of tell you where I was when particular dramatic moments happened in things, because, as Dan said, I kind of both got locked in. So I was both not there, I was somewhere else, but I was also kind of staring at something, but that thing has now become connected. There's a branch outside that's has become connected with a man from China who played one piano piece in a variety of places during COVID, because I heard his story, him describing his father's psychosis when he explained why he played that piece of piano as I was cutting a tree. And so that tree will always connect to that moment, because I was both with him playing Happy Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and hearing him talking about it, so all those things. And that to me is the joy of audio, is that because you aren't captive and you have people on the move, if you can capture them, you can kind of take them, you can put an imprint in their brain, because they do so much of the work for the audience. So yeah.
There's one more question I'd like to ask. We're coming up with, well, just over 6, but one final question that's been sent in. But in your answers, you can, if you want to, say something else entirely, or ask somebody else in the panel a question. But this is the question that came in about that obviously that there's been various kind of cuts, and there's challenges we're very aware of, and whether you felt that original audio drama, that whether it was under threat from a push to do things that are about, using existing IP and stuff. So I suppose the question for you is originality, opportunities to write original drama. Any comments really of how what your wish would be, what you would like to see happen, but equally, if you want to address the question to any of the others, do so.
My instinct is that it is the one. I just don't. I would very much hope that if anything is preserved, it is original work. because that's the thing, is that we cannot represent the voices of the United Kingdom without that. You take that, and and I know a lot of my writers who work both in telly and in audio, and one of them said, which is beautiful, I am a craftsman on telly and I am an artist on the radio, because the chances of ever getting your voice, your story told on television is minute. So you are always writing to somebody else. It feels to me like that it is the one thing that must be preserved.
Anyone else on the panel want to jump in?
Gosh, I mean, my first radio drama, I thought myself as a poet at the time. I was writing poetry, still write poetry, and did a course with Winston Pinnock, produced a few pages. I had my friends in a writing group that I was a member of laugh when I read the pages out loud, thought they were laughing at me, realized they were laughing because they quite liked the characters that came alive. And then had the, I don't know, in moment I thought was pure folly and bullishness, entered those few pages into the Stage of the Sound, which was a scheme to find new writers, I think, from diverse backgrounds. And it was accepted, and that was my first Radio 4 commission. Others I knew had local commissions. In a sense, I think it's an entry point to writing to an audience. It's an entry point to being able to play with world building. It's an entry point to writing filmically. That is so much more democratic than I think the opportunities are out there and available. It just seems insane that you would reduce that opportunity for people to really enter into a world of writing, and to have it, in a sense, critically reviewed, shaped by professionals. I mean, I trust radio in a way that I sometimes don't always trust other mediums, because I know that the producer and myself, we want to produce good work. That's the only reason why we're in the room, and it's already gone through a process in which it's been competitive with other people who cut the right arm off for that opportunity. Other mediums, sometimes you wonder about why. Are you fulfilling some criteria? Or again, as Kirsty was saying, you're writing in screen and it's chopped and shaped by a whole plethora of other considerations. We just seem to be going against, I think, what is required, which is more transparent and more diverse ways of people having access to writing. But also access to a world of fellow writers and producers. And radio offers that, and it's not just an entry point, it's the place that I prefer, that I'd like to go back and forth between other mediums, because it's its own unique offer. I hope we see sense, really. It's just like many things we do, nationalizing and selling off assets and so on. I hope we see sense and realize the value of radio. And as Dan said, it is a special thing to be able to capture someone in the afternoon who's doing something completely different, and they engage with you like it's a script, like it's a book at bedtime. They could walk away, but they can't. You won them, you won their loyalty. They want to stay with you, or they want to fall asleep later on because they've missed the ending and listen to the whole thing again. Why would you reduce that gift to the world?
Shall I jump in?
Yes, please.
Yeah, just from a writerly perspective, I haven't written many radio dramas. So I just, talk of carts and sort of the streamlining of opportunities. It really frightens me as a writer, as a newish radio writer. And the fact that I engage in a very specialized kind of storytelling, which is centered around sort of South Asian worlds and characters. Having gone through the sort of proposal commissioning process, seeing the things that are rejected, seeing the things that are accepted, it feels very precarious. And I feel so grateful for the opportunities I've already had, but I just worry about radio drama in the future. I worry about it being homogenous, myopic, privileged, all of that, because it's like how many diverse underrepresented stories can we push through? How many will, if there's a squeeze on radio drama overall, how will that impact actually on those more underrepresented stories and dramas? So I don't know, that's my kind of, yeah, I feel a sense of, I don't know, just a sense of uncertainty around it all. But I guess that's, that's the living state of being a writer as well, across mediums right now, across the arts, that there are cutbacks and squeezes on, squeeze on commissioning across the board. But that's how I feel. And I love writing for radio, absolutely love it. And I'd love for more writers like myself to have that opportunity. So yeah, that's how I'm feeling.
I think that both those things are true. I think it's precarious for everybody, but at the same time, everything you say is absolutely true, that the more things get precarious and the more things contract, they can narrow as well. And it can become much more about, it can come down to a very few writers writing a lot of things, and then that's a shame because there's a lot of people listening. But for anybody who's listening who is writing their first audio drama, or that never goes away, that sense of obstacle course, does it? I mean, we, on the audio committee, we tend to commiserate with one another every offers round, and maybe one or two people will get something shortlisted, and there is never a point. Maybe that's one thing I actually quite like about audio drama. With TV, there's a big discrepancy between people who are just doing the occasional episode or might get a story developed but never leads anywhere. But I think that audio, if it can at least stay as it is and then maybe expand with original drama, is probably more opportunity to write for it, even though it is always going to be a slog. So if you send things in and nothing happens, then don't stop.
Yeah. Oh no, I wouldn't. I won't stop. Of
No,
course.
please, you don't stop. Absolutely, no.
No, it is. I think it's working within that sort of precarious terrain, trying to come up with ideas and putting the reality of whatever the industry might be or whatever that environment might be, and actually trying to separate that from the creativity of coming up with ideas, trying to, constantly push drama, suggestions, whatever it might be. I don't think, yeah. I think they coexist, and it's sort of two sides of the same coin. The creativity is fantastic, but yeah, sometimes the industry not so much. But yeah,
Fantastic.
that's the way I'm a writer.
I think that's quite a good point to end. We've gone a little bit over time, but I think that's a really nice point to end, of just that the creativity is really important, but it is really tough. But that's, yeah, just do it. Thank you, everybody. I would happily have talked to everybody all day. I think that's fantastic. It's lovely to just sort of meet together, isn't it, Lucy, to meet the
really lovely. Yeah, really interesting, really stimulating, actually. And it's lovely to just share that the experience of audio drama and the pleasure that it is to write, but also to listen to, to celebrate audio drama, I think is really special.
And just to say that I know Edson Burton's Man Friday is available. That's been put in the chat. Satinder Chauhan's Southall Uprising is still there on its link. A Tale of Ossian, written by Robert Forrest, who's unfortunately not well enough to join us today, but directed by Kirsty. That's still online. Dan, have they put back up your Restless Dreams? Is that available to listen on the
They haven't
BBC?
yet, but don't tell the BBC, it's on my website.
So Dan's website, secretly, go on Dan's website and you can listen there. So please, if you haven't already, or in fact, if you have, listen again to those. And thank you all. Congratulations to you all. Your plays are fantastic. And please, if you're not a member of the Writers Guild, or whether that's a panelist or somebody in the audience, do have a look on the website and think about joining, because we have lots of great events, and together we are stronger.